Hello and welcome to my channel. As you know, we are in the exam ready series and there's only just few days left, and we will be rolling up this series with some interesting and important questions to discuss. And today, taking up the epidemiology of communicable disease in the part 2. The first important question that we are going to take up is a clinical scenario and how the BMH is going to take the action. Remember, this type of questions, the BMH ones, are almost definitely going to come in your paper, only with the disease in question may vary. Here I'll be discussing a case of AFP, that is acute flaccid paralysis, of a 4-year-old boy who has been reported from a village in certain district, and the outline measures to be taken by the BMH as per the strategies of polio eradication. It may come in concern to some other disease, and the outline may be given that what are the steps to be taken by the BMH as per the existing national program. So here it's a case of polio and I have given the outline accordingly. If any other disease comes, you have to modify on the same skeletal framework but with relevant reference to the disease concerned. So here the first is the confirmation of the case, and that is to be done on the basis of clinical case definition. In this particular case, because it is AFP, we will take the definition of AFP clinical case. There is any child under 15 years of age with sudden onset paralysis or paralytic illness in any person of any age when polio is suspected. The immediate reporting to the surveillance medical officer investigated within 48 hours to confirm the diagnosis and obtain the lab specimens. Next is the lab specimen. What it is? It is the 2 stool samples that are taken 24 to 48 hours apart and sent to the designated laboratory that maintain the cold chain for virus isolation. And this is treated as public health emergency if wild polio virus strain is detected. The next in line is the area mapping with beneficiary listing, resource estimation, and social mobilization. The outbreak investigation, or ORI, involves the covering of entire area where AP case has been reported from all under 5 vaccinated with the oral polio vaccine. The mop-up, that is the end strategy of polio eradication, preferably within 2 weeks of confirmation of case. Non-high risk areas to have 3 quality rounds with minimum interval of 2 weeks. And high risk areas, the subnational immunization days to have more than 3 rounds. And case to be followed up to 60 days to look for residual paralysis. Continue the routine immunization with coverage monitoring through routine reporting system. IPPI, that is intensified pulse polio immunization, to be carried out through the national and subnational immunization days. The first day vaccine post immunization followed by 3 days of home visit of any missed child. So now that you have the basic outline, you'll have to build on that. Now coming to a important question relevant to another communicable disease, that is HIV/AIDS. This is a very common format of question. That is, name some common STDs and what measures do you suggest for its prevention and control with special reference to HIV/AIDS. So if you are asked to name some common STDs, it is better that along with the causative agent, you give the name of the STDs. Like here I have listed Neisseria gonorrhoeae causing gonorrhea, Chlamydia trachomatis causing chlamydial infection or NLGV, Treponema pallidum causing syphilis, Haemophilus ducreyi causing chancroid, Klebsiella granulomatis causing donovanosis or granuloma inguinal, Herpes simplex causing the herpes progenitus, and so on. Now coming to the most important second part, that what measures do you suggest for its prevention and control with special reference to HIV/AIDS? Well, Prevention and control of STIs should be an integral part of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services in order to contribute towards the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals and respond to the call for improved sexual as well as reproductive health. Globally, the predominant mode of transmission of HIV is sexual, which makes it a STI, even though there are other modes too through which HIV may be transmitted. Preventing and treating other STIs reduces the risk of sexual transmission of HIV, especially among the population who are most likely to have high number of sex partners, such as sex workers and their clients. The presence of untreated inflammatory or ulcerative sexually transmitted diseases increases the risk of transmission of HIV during unprotected sex between an infected and an uninfected partner. So these are the measures for prevention and control in reference to HIV. Here in this connection, it is important to know a very important aspect of STI, that is the syndromic approach. The syndromic approach adopted by NACO is a primary strategy for management of STIs. In this approach, the diagnosis is based on the identification of syndromes, which are combinations of the symptoms that the client reports and the signs the healthcare provider observes. The recommended treatments are effective for all diseases that could cause the identified syndrome. The syndromic management has some advantages and some limitations. Here we will be discussing them one by one. Let's look at the advantages. The patient is diagnosed and treated in one visit. Highly effective for most of the syndromes. Relatively inexpensive, and there is no need for the patient to return for lab results. All possible STIs are treated at once. Scientifically tested in many parts of the globe. Easy for health workers to learn and practice for patients. Integrated into primary healthcare services more easily and can be used by providers at all levels. Now looking at the limitation. Well, it is not useful in asymptomatic individuals. Over-treatment in patient with one STI that causes a syndrome. Financial cost of over-treatment, side effects, and the increased potential for antibiotic resistance, especially if the full course is not completed. STI-RTI service delivery is also another important aspect which you should be aware of, because the Suraksha clinic often comes in the form of short notes. So, the Suraksha clinics are the delivery points of STI-RTI services, and the communication is done through using color-coded kits. The 5 steps in syndromic STI case management involves history taking and examination, syndromic diagnosis and treatment using flowcharts, education and counseling on HIV testing and safer sex, including condom promotion and provision, management of sexual partners, recording and reporting. The color-coded STI-RTI drug kits according to the syndrome are available at the Suraksha clinics. The kit 1, that is grey one, which consists of azithromycin and cefixime, is for urethral or anorectal or cervical discharge. The kit 2, that is the green one, containing secnidazole and fluconazole, is for vaginitis or vaginal discharge. The kit 3 is white and it is containing benzathine penicillin, azithromycin, along with disposable syringes and gauge needles and sterile water. And it is used for genital ulcer diseases, the non-herpetic ones. In the genital ulcer disease, non-herpetic, who are allergic to penicillin, they are given the kit 4, which is blue in color. Here, instead of penicillin, the doxycycline is incorporated in the dosage. In the herpetic genetic ulcer disease, the kit 5 is used, which is red in color, and it contains acyclovir with a dose for 7 days. In low abdominal pain, there is PID, that's pelvic inflammatory diseases. The kit 6 is used, which is yellow in color, which consists of cefixime, metronidazole, as well as doxycycline. And it's usually for a period of 14 days. The inguinal bubo uses the kit 6, that is black in color, and it consists of doxycycline and azithromycin. And here, the doxycycline is given for a period of 21 days. So the diagnosis is based in this Suraksha clinics through syndromic assessment and risk assessment, and then the treatment is ensued. Here, 5 C's are followed. What are the 5 C's? It's very easy to remember for you. The C's, that is C1, first C is for contact tracing, second C is for condom use, third C is for compliance, fourth C is counseling, and fifth C is the confidentiality of the patients. Now coming from HIV/AIDS to pulmonary tuberculosis. This is another important area. Supposing the question comes that in a rural area, a case of pulmonary TB was detected in a woman aged 30 years. She has one 36-month-old child who has been given BCG vaccination and a husband aged 40 years. What will be the line of management for the case according to RNTCP if she fulfills one of the criteria of category 1? What will be the 3 most important tuberculosis control measures that are used to prevent tuberculosis infection and communication messages for the community for prevention of tuberculosis? Well, coming to the very first part, that is line of management. And for the woman belonging to the disease, the case scenario mentioned, the woman belongs to the category 1 of patients. And the treatment involves the regimen of 2 HRZE3, that is thrice weekly, and 4 HR3, that is 4 months of HR thrice weekly. If pre-treatment sputum is positive, the test is to be done at the second month again after 2 months. If positive, the intensive phase is to be continued for 1 more month. If negative, the continuation phase may be started. And again the testing of the sputum to take place at 4 months and 6 months. If pre-treatment sputum is negative at the 2 months of medication, if positive, continue intensive phase for 1 more month, test sputum at 3, 4 and 7 months. If negative, continuation phase, test sputum again at 6 months. Any patient treated with category 1 has positive smears at 5, 6 or 7 months of treatment should be considered as treatment failure and treated as category 2 regime afresh. Since the woman in concern has a 36-month child who has been already given BCG vaccination, it falls into the most susceptible age group for childhood tuberculosis, that is 1 to 4 years. So contact with adult case of pulmonary tuberculosis makes the necessity of chest X-ray and Mantoux test to be done. A symptomatic child contact with positive Mantoux test more than 10 milliliter to be treated as case regardless of the BCG vaccination status. If it is treated as a case, then INH 10 to 15 mg per kg, rifampicin 10 mg per kg, pyrazinamide 35 mg per kg and streptomycin 15 mg per kg thrice a week to be started. If no symptoms of tuberculosis, tuberculin test is available. 3 months INH preventive chemotherapy, then tuberculin test. If less than 6 mm in duration, the chemotherapy is to be stopped. If no symptoms of tuberculosis, tuberculin test is not available. Preventive chemotherapy with INH 5 mg per kg body weight for next 6 months. Coming to the community-based tuberculosis activities that positively influences the outcome of drug-sensitive, drug-resistant and HIV-associated tuberculosis, where it mostly focuses on the prevention, diagnosis, improvement of treatment adherence, care, and as well as community mobilization with community-based tuberculosis activities being conducted at all levels, integrated with other healthcare services. The major principles involves establishing collaborative mechanisms and scaling up, integrated in the community-based tuberculosis activities, a single national system for monitoring implementation of activities by all actors with standardized indicators, and efforts must be inclusive rather than exclusive. The 3 main tuberculosis control measures that are used to prevent tuberculosis infection are sometimes called the 3 I's. What are the 3 I's? The first I is for intensified case finding for tuberculosis. The second I is for isoniazid preventive therapy or IPT for prevention of tuberculosis among people living with HIV. And the third I is infection control for prevention of tuberculosis. So these are the 3 I's that are used for tuberculosis measures. Now coming to the last part, that is what would be the community messages concerned with tuberculosis management. Well, firstly is maintaining the natural ventilation. The houses should be adequately ventilated. Smear positive tuberculosis patient care should be as much as possible outdoors and should spend as little as time in congregate settings or on public transport. Thirdly, awareness regarding importance of infection control in the community should be promoted. Cough manners and respiratory hygiene needs to be adopted. Practicing standard precautions, that is, hand washing and antisepsis, using of PPEs, appropriate handling of patient care equipment and soiled clothes, prevention of accidental needle stick or sharp injuries to health workers, environmental cleaning and spills management, appropriate handling of clinical waste. Here in this connection, I will discuss certain trivia which is good to know for you from your exam point of view. Like, what is XDR-TB? And what is the difference between MDR-TB and XDR-TB? Well, MDR-TB is strains of tuberculosis that are resistant to rifampicin and isoniazid, whereas XDR-TB, that is often referred as the extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, is strains of TB that are resistant to rifampicin and isoniazid, as well as resistance to fluoroquinolone and to at least one of the 3 injectable TB drugs, that is caprimycin, kanamycin, and amikacin. Elimination in tuberculosis is defined by World Health Organization as less than 1% with tuberculosis for a population of 1 million people. And burden of tuberculosis in India? Well, India accounts for about quarter of the global TB burden. In 2018, the estimated TB incidence was 269,000 and estimated 9,700 HIV positive people died due to tuberculosis itself. Now coming to PMDT, well, it's an abbreviation of Programmatic Management of Drug-Resistant Tuberculosis. It promotes full integration of basic tuberculosis control and PMDT activities under the RNTCP program. Now we will discuss some of these short notes which are relevant to communicable diseases. Firstly, India is a yellow fever receptive area. Explain. Well, it is an receptive area, and what does a receptive area means? That is an area in which yellow fever doesn't exist, but where condition would permit its development if introduced. The population of India is unvaccinated and hence particularly susceptible to yellow fever. Now coming to vitamin A supplementation necessary after measles infection. Explain. Well, vitamin A deficiency is a recognized risk factor for severe measles. The World Health Organization and the UN issued a joint statement recommending that vitamin A to be administered to all children diagnosed with measles in communities where vitamin A deficiency, that is serum vitamin A, is less than 10 microgram per deciliter and where mortality related to measles is more than 1%. The recommended regime is 100,000 international units by mouth at the time of diagnosis for infants younger than 12 months of age and 2 lakh international units for older children. In the presence of ophthalmologic signs of vitamin A deficiency such as night blindness, bitter spot, grayish-white deposits on the bulbar conjunctiva adjacent to the cornea, or xerophthalmia, that is drying of the cornea, the WHO recommends the dose to be repeated in 24 hours and again in 4 weeks later. Coming to another important short question, there is a role of IPV in polio eradication. Well, a global coordinated withdrawal of the type 2 component of TOPV from the immunization program, that is a trivalent OPV. This will require switching from the trivalent OPV to the bivalent OPV. The bivalent OPV contains only the type 1 and 3 for that purpose. IPV is given in addition to the existing OPV doses and does not replace any OPV doses. As IPV immunogenicity is highest after 14 weeks of age due to reduction in the maternal antibodies that otherwise interfere with immunogenicity, IPV administration at 14 weeks maximizes the benefit of IPV in protecting children against type 2 poliovirus after OPV2 cessation, while helping to close immunity gaps to types 1 and 3 virus. The primary role of introducing one-dose IPV into routine immunization program is to mitigate risk associated with OPV withdrawal and the potential reintroduction of polioviruses. IPV will maintain type 2 poliovirus immunity during the TOPV-BOPV switch. Unlike OPV, and IPV is also having the advantage that it is not a live vaccine and hence carries no risk of vaccine-associated polio paralysis. And IPV induces humoral and oral immunity to polioviruses and boosts intestinal immunity in children previously vaccinated with OPV. So now coming to another important question of influenza. The question says all influenza pandemics are caused by influenza A and not by B or C. Explain. So let's look at the picture. There are 4 types of influenza viruses: A, B, C and D. Human influenza A and B viruses cause seasonal epidemics of diseases. And the influenza A viruses, the influenza viruses may undergo antigenic drift or antigenic shift. Antigenic shift is an abrupt major change in the influenza A virus resulting in new hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins in the influenza viruses that infects the humans. The shift can result in new influenza A subtype in the humans. It happens when the influenza virus from an animal population gains the ability to infect humans. So what happens? The animal origin virus can contain an HA or HANA combination that are completely novel in nature and that most people do not have an immunity to. A very good example of this would be in 2009 incident when an H1N1 virus with genes from North American swine, Eurasian swine, humans and birds emerged to infect people and quickly spread, causing a pandemic. Influenza A virus undergoes both antigenic drift as well as antigenic shift, found in many birds and animals. Influenza A viruses are divided into subtypes based on the 2 proteins on the surface of the virus, that is hemagglutinin or H protein and neuraminidase or N protein. Hence, there are potentially 198 different influenza A subtype combinations, although only 131 subtypes have been detected in nature till now. The influenza B, compared to this whole scenario, is typically found only in humans and change is very gradual process of antigenal drift. There is no antigenic shift. And influenza C infection generally cause very mild illness and are not thought to cause human flu epidemics. And influenza D virus primarily affect the cattle and are not known to infect or cause illness in humans. Hence, the picture so emerges that influenza A viruses are the only influenza virus that are capable of causing flu pandemics, that is at the global level. Now coming to another important question related to HIV/AIDS only. That is, explain that AIDS is a behavioral disease. Well, it is evident that behavioral factors affect the spread of HIV infection both direct and by implications from high-risk behavior in general. The prevalence of high-risk behaviors over time shows the risk is increasing in populations. Unprotected sexual intercourse, anal intercourse, intercourse with adolescent women or women more than 45 years, etc. are high-risk behaviors. Behavior of rich population, that is the truckers, laborers, tourists, are also important in spreading HIV/AIDS because sexually transmitted diseases, especially ulcerative ones, predisposes to HIV/AIDS infection around 8 to 10 times more. The HIV spreads more among homosexual and bisexual men, judging by both HIV seroprevalence and that of gonococcal proctitis, and other risk behaviors associated with HIV infection include use of drugs, alcohol, tobacco, having multiple sex partners, and intravenous drug use with needle sharing. Blood transfusion recipients and healthcare workers are also predisposed to risk. On the other hand, conditions correlated with safe behaviors include knowing of one's positive HIV status, possessing skills of safe sex, perceiving one's risk accurately, and having the peer support. Peer support is extremely influential in this particular condition and includes general social support, peer expectations, and support for behavioral change and capability to seek help when needed. Health education enables people to take life-saving choices. Preventing interventions are now our best defense against the epidemic, but they require a clear understanding of the behavioral as well as the mental health aspects of HIV infection and AIDS. So as it emerges from the above different points we have discussed that how AIDS comes across to be a behavioral disease. And what is the role of pre-test counseling for HIV/AIDS and why is it so useful? Well, HIV testing and counseling forms the gateway to care, treatment and support for persons in need. The pre-test counseling caters to the informational, emotional and social needs of those attending the counseling at the ICTCs. And these informations are to be granted in such a way that it is acceptable, accessible, client-oriented, confidential, and as well as with the right knowledge. The main goal of pre-test counseling is to enable the individual to make good use of the test results, to assist those with negative test results to remain uninfected, and those who are positive to minimize the medical, social, and emotional impact of HIV on their own lives as well as the people around them. The misinformation and extremely negative conceptualization of HIV/AIDS as a social and physical death increase feelings of distress and helplessness and foster denial and secrecy, which in turn poses grave risk to the health and well-being of seropositives as well as those near them. Testing for HIV can put the patient through enormous stress and trauma, since a lot of fear, stigma and dread is associated with the disease. So whether the test result is positive or negative, it's essential for the patient to go through a thorough pre-test counseling. After having been provided with sufficient information to enable informed consent, all patients can opt out of being tested further or not. So, as it emerges, interactive, constructive information about HIV prevention and care through this pre-test counseling will increase the preparedness of the community as well as whole for effective living with HIV for the individual concerned. Now, from moving on from HIV/AIDS to hepatitis B, explain the rationality of giving hepatitis B vaccine in infants. That why should hepatitis B vaccine be given in infants? Because it's largely taken as a sexually transmitted disease. Well, the most important reason for it is to prevent HBV infection early in life with the possible lifelong complications of chronic disease in the form of liver failure and liver cancer that affect so many who are infected at birth because of vertical transmission or perinatal infection. It can be chronic and even fatal in newborns. HBV transmission often occurring vertically from mother to child at birth and horizontally from an HBV infected adult or another child's infected body fluids to an unvaccinated baby or child. The main benefit of the vaccine is its effectiveness. If the first dose of the hepatitis B vaccine within the 24 hours of the baby's delivery, it is 75 to 95% effective in preventing the passage of hepatitis B from the mother to the baby. For the best possible protection, the baby will need to complete the full series of required vaccine of hepatitis B. Now, one more question of tuberculosis. That is revised National Tuberculosis Control Program gives detection and new smear positive cases. Explain. Well, tuberculosis is an infectious disease and it is caused by, as you all know, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And it remains a major public health problem in India. The RNTSP object states to achieve and maintain a tuberculosis treatment success rate of at least 85% among the new sputum positive patients, that is NSP, and to achieve and maintain detection of at least 70% of the estimated new sputum positive people in the community. Well, it is spread through the air from people suffering from tuberculosis. A new smear positive patient can infect 10 or more people in 1 year, being highly infectious. Hence, if not intercepted by diagnosing and treated at the earliest, it would spread the infection in the community much higher. And it is easily accessible and available diagnostic services to achieve this. High cure rate in this category of tuberculosis cases with low chances of resistance, giving it a better chance of recovery. And hence, the program gives a priority on detection of this new smear positive cases. And last but not least, another hepatitis B infection question. Well, why it is considered to be sometimes more dangerous than HIV infection? Well, hepatitis B is a serious and a deadly disease. It infects people of all ages and as many as 2.2 million people in the US are chronically infected, and in India, the figure is also quite staggeringly high. Up to 40% of chronic infections lead to cirrhosis, liver failure and liver cancer, and which may even lead to death. Most importantly, it is easily spread. It is 50 to 100 times more infectious than in HIV and can live outside the body for more than 7 days and still cause infection. And 2/3 of those living with chronic hepatitis do not even know they're infected, but can still keep spreading the infection to others, which makes it deadly. And many adults are at risk. Those who are having diabetes, chronic liver disease, immigrants coming from Southeast Asia, those who are infected with HIV, multiple sexual partners, IV drug users, they are at added risk of hepatitis B. So overall, the picture emerges that hepatitis B comes across as more dangerous than HIV infection. Well, with just 2 days left to your exam, happy studying, all the very best. We'll be uploading some more important and relevant questions. Like, share, do subscribe and comment. Subscribing is completely free, so do it. It would really encourage more contents in this channel. Thank you so much and all the very best again. So, thank you for now. Happy studying.